I'm really extremely pleased to have here today Dr. James Gifford. I'm going to let James introduce himself. But really for me, this is, if I could have wished this, I would have wished for this, as I've, often heard of this name and you, James. And therefore, if I'm sure I'll be one of many people who really do enjoy listening to this. So I'll pass to you, and thank you again for being here.
Thanks very much, Marcus, and really delighted to be here. So tonight I'm going to give you the story of ESG, these three letters which sort of mean so much to so many people, good or bad. I was there at the beginning, and I'll give you the inside word. Now, I'm going to come from an investor perspective because ESG came out of the investor community and then went into the corporate community. And it really starts with the E and the S. There was a German forester, administrator in 1713 who coined this term Nachhaltigkeit, I think. It's me, German. But that basically means sustainability. And that was the first recognition in the forestry space of this idea that a resource should be able to continue producing forever. And then across the channel, there was the founder of the Methodist Church, John Wesley, and he had a really famous sermon called The Use of Money, where he talked about using money not to, in ways that, sure, create gain. So he really had that Protestant work ethic thing. So no problem with making money, but don't do it in ways that harm your neighbor. Don't sell products that harm the health of your customers. He didn't use those words, but in effect, he was the first sort of social, ethical business, advocate. And then we move forward many years, 17th, 18th centuries, the Quakers were very much a pacifist organization. They also fought against slavery, and they refused to invest in the stocks of companies that benefited from slavery. And so you started getting this exclusion kind of concept. Then we move forward to the 20th century, and in the early 70s, we had civil rights. We had this huge rising of social awareness about justice and so on. And in the United States, we had the Vietnam War. And the Pax World Fund, which is still in existence, was the first official ethical fund to be launched in the world that excluded specific sectors, and in this case, companies that were benefiting from profiteering as they saw it from the Vietnam War. And then in the 80s, we had apartheid, and there was a huge activist campaign against the South African regime. And that was the first time a pension fund stood up and said, we are going to vote against companies at the AGM. We're going to file resolutions and demand that these companies withdraw from South Africa. And this was, and CalPERS, the Californian pension scheme, that was the first time they actually voted in an AGM on a social issue. So you had the exclusion agenda or the screening agenda in the 70s. You had the shareholder activist agenda emerge in the 80s. And in the 90s, you had Nike and the sweatshop allegations. You had the more religious investors jumping on board there. And then you had the rise of the G. And the Cadbury report in the UK was the corporate governance report that really defined that we should have a separate board and CBO, that we should have an independent audit committee and those kinds of things. And so the G really rose as a response to corporate scandals and really imperial CEOs, believing that they control the company, when in fact, the CEO is really just the servant of the shareholders. And so that brings us to about the year 2000, where I came in. I was a long-haired forest activist. Unfortunately, I don't have my golden May anymore. And I worked for an organization called the Wilderness Society. And we were doing shareholder activism against a forestry company in Tasmania. And we were looking at this company and saying, well, who are the shareholders? Well, the shareholders were Australian superannuation pension funds. More than 40% of this really bad company was owned by ordinary Australians. And so we said, well, let's file a shareholder resolution. Surely we're going to get lots of support from these pension funds because 80% of Australians supported an end to old growth logging in Tasmania. We got 1%. And for me, that was a huge wake up call. It was like, wow, capital is really not reflecting the values of the people who literally own that money. And if those people were allowed to express their preferences, then we would have a very different world. And that really began a 2-year journey. So what I did was I did a master's where I did a thesis on comparing the two main strategies of sustainable investing at the time. It's called socially responsible investing or ethical investing. And that was screening or exclusions on one hand and shareholder activism on the other hand. And I did orderly analysis of the block trade literature. What are block trades? Well, block trades are when big institutional investors have to sell huge blocks of a company, mostly because the company goes in or out of an index. So if the company becomes the 501st company from the S&P 500, they're no longer in the S&P 500. And all of these fund managers who own stocks running on an S&P 500 strategy have to sell the stock because it's no longer in the index. You would think that would have a massive share price effect. Actually, in most cases, the shares are trading at exactly the same as what they were after 12 days. What does this mean? Liquid markets are pretty efficient. That means that it doesn't matter. You can buy and sell stocks all day long, and it really doesn't make any difference whatsoever. Whereas shareholder activism, what I found with my research and just the literature review of everything that happened since the 70s was that shareholder activism had a very strong evidence base that it actually works, at least a bit. And so I then decided to do a PhD on shareholder activism, how to make it as effective as possible. I went to the UN at the end of 2003 as an intern. And after 6 weeks, I pitched this idea. We should develop a set of principles around this idea. We should get the world's biggest pension funds to start doing shareholder engagement on sustainability issues and pushing companies to be more sustainable based on UN norms and UN agreements and so on. And I pitched this idea and got hired to take that forward. And that became the UN Principles for Responsible Investment. I led the drafting process, became the first employee, and built up that organization over 10 years. When I left, we had, I think, some thousands of signatories and trillions, tens of trillions of dollars. And since I left in 2013, it's only grown even further. Now, how did we develop this initiative? Well, we knew that the pension funds were not going to buy into an ethical agenda. We knew they weren't going to say, oh, tobacco, that's so evil. We can't invest in that. No, what they said was fiduciary duty. That's all that matters. And as people, as I know there's a lot of lawyers in the room, fiduciary duty was the absolute measure of the pension fund sector. We're talking about sustainable investing. So we said, fine, we will put the exclusions thing off the agenda. And at the same time, between about year 2000 and 2004, a lot more people were talking about strategic corporate sustainability, where sustainability and profitability can be aligned, and where risk, sustainability can actually also be a risk and an opportunity. So we said a subset of these issues are potentially financially material. Therefore, you should take them into account. Now, we were coming from the E&S background, right? We were very much the activists. And we said, you know what? The corporate governance guys, they're like the guys in their 50s and 60s with gray hair. They've got a lot more credibility than us. And so actually we decided to appropriate the G and stick it on to the ENES for a very deliberate strategy of giving the ENES more credibility than we would have had otherwise. And so we actually packaged up this ESG acronym in early 2004, and we said, these are a package of issues which traditional financial analysts don't take into account very deeply at all. They can be potentially financially material and therefore should be taken into account. Now, because we were working with pension funds and they were so paranoid of fiduciary duty, we said, look, let's really lock this in. So we hired Freshfields, the law firm, a UK law firm, and we gave them a brief. We said, look, just assume that a subset of sustainability issues are potentially material, financially material, risk issues, opportunity issues, longer term, strategic drivers, whatever. Now go and do a report for us on whether it is within the realm of fiduciary duty to take these issues into account. Now we kind of pre-cooked that, right? Of course, if it's material, it's going to be within fiduciary duty. But all we needed was the headline to say, whoa, fiduciary duty allows ESG. And we got it. And Freshfields absolutely delivered. And then we just banged the whole industry over the head with this Freshfields report for about 3 years saying, if you want to be a good fiduciary, you have to take into account ESG issues. It is not only compatible with fiduciary duty, arguably, if issues are material, is required by fiduciary duty to take into account ESG issues. Now, how do you take into account ESG issues? You have to buy the data. Buy from whom? ESG research providers. So we catalyzed an industry. When we started, there were less than 100 ESG research providers. Physical, like people, not companies, people. And then by the time I left the PRI, I think there were probably 5,000 to 10,000. I'd say now there's more than 20,000 ESG research providers selling ESG data to investment institutions, including the people at the fund managers. So that was really the origin of the PRI. There's a funny story, actually. We had to get the Secretary General of the United Nations, you might remember Kofi Annan, a very charismatic Secretary General, far more so than his successors. And he is very hard to get hold of. Now, we were this little unit inside the UN. We had no authorization from up in the UN Environment Program. We were just operating a real renegade sort of hunch. And so my friend in university superannuation scheme, he said, look, we've got to get Kofi Annan. And I'm like, look, I'm trying, but my boss's boss, and you know how it is in UN bureaucracy world. Really difficult. And so he goes, okay, I'll help. So he goes, I'll get my chairman, a guy called Sir Graham Davies, to write to the head of the United Nations Environment Program, Klaus Topfer, and get him to then ask Kofi Annan if he would be the front man for this UN issue, these principles. And so my friend, I said, it's a great idea. So he said, can you write the letter? So I wrote the letter from Sir Graham to Klaus Topfer, my boss's boss. And then went up to my friends at Sir Graham, went across to Nairobi to Klaus Topfer, went back through 5 different levels, back to my desk for a response. I'm like, I can't answer this. So I wrote a response. Absolutely, it's essential that Kofi Annan that leads this initiative goes back up to. My friend sends me great response. I said, yes, I wrote that too. How about you write a thank you note back from Sir Graham to Klaus Topfer? So I wrote all of the correspondence to the entire thing. And we got Kofi Annan as the figurehead, which really made a difference to the launching of the PRI. Now, after 10 years, the PRI had grown incredibly large, and I figured there's something missing here. The PRI was based on this idea that, ESG issues can be material. Maybe you can do some shareholder engagement if you see laggards who aren't fulfilling their risk obligations, whatever it is. But what I realized is that these investors are not leaders. When I first got into this space, I assumed the people with money had the power. It's kind of intuitive, right? You think, oh, these big institutions, they must be so powerful. They're sitting on such big chunks of money. But when you overlay a fiduciary duty and you overlay that typical pension fund governance structure, they have no leadership at all role in society. They are absolute followers and they have to meet asset class benchmarks. They have to deliver a bureaucratic function. And what I realized after 10 years of working with large institutions is that's not where it's at if we want to solve the world's problems. Where is it at? Well, it has to be early stage technology. We have to innovate our way out of climate. We certainly can't regulate our way out of climate, given that most of the emissions are happening in the developing countries. We have to innovate our way. We have to innovate our way in healthcare, in education, in all kinds of aspects. And that is where early stage venture capital comes in. Now, that's one of two pillars. The second pillar is frontier markets. We have to help 2 billion people get out of poverty. And if we don't, you can forget whatever climate targets you're hoping. And basically, Europe is just going to be this fairyland tourist attraction, while actually Lagos is like 15 million, 20, 30 million people of just this mass of humanity. Do you think we're going to save the Congo forest if you have, this huge growing population of extremely poor people pumping up coal-fired power and whatever? So who's going to do that? Well, it isn't the signatories to the PRI. They are all big, clunky institutions who are not leading anything. It has to be private wealth. It has to be family offices, ultra-high net worth people, foundations. There's a role for government as well, some of the innovation funds, development finance institutions, but private wealth. So I then pivoted and went to the Harvard Kennedy School and set up a new course on impact investing for ultra high net worth people. Now, as far as I know, it's the only course where the actual entry requirement is that you have to have more than $100 million. So if anybody in the room is one of these families, come and talk to me. Our next cohort is in October. And it's a 7-day boot camp for the inheritors of the world's wealthiest families. We've had some really eminent families, 2 of the Cargill kids. We've had, probably maybe some of the family members behind some of the companies you might be involved with. And we now have 300 alumni after 10 years of running this course. It's a 7-day boot camp. And our alumni have deployed $3 billion in private market impact funds and another 15 to 20 billion in ESG liquid strategies since doing our course. So I think for a 7-day course run 10 times, that's a very effective program. Now, at the same time, after 3 years, I then went to UBS and led impact investing, and then went to Credit Suisse, and then rest in peace. Credit Suisse died, and I'm now freelance. But I'm really proud of what I did. At UBS, at Credit Suisse, we raised about $1.5 billion into shareholder activist funds, which is the only mechanism of impact within listed equities. And we raised $400 million for climate VC funds, which again, I think is incredibly important. I put money in that myself. Unfortunately, I'm not sure if I'm going to get all or any of it back. But I was very proud that we were able to deploy so much money into that. However, at the same time as I was working in the banks, I started feeling this creeping regulatory, bureaucratic sand in the gearbox. At SFDR and MiFID suitability requirements. And I started seeing the headcounts of the people doing compliance just go up and up and up. And I started seeing headcounts of people doing product development, innovation, impact fund due diligence, client relationships on sustainability start to go down. And then you had all of these greenwashing sort of business in the EU. And I saw firsthand that this regulation simply doesn't work. Now, why is the EU regulation on sustainable investing so utterly hopeless? Now, I was quoted in Environmental Finance magazine, where the journalist put the headline of the article was "SFDR is an utter disaster," and the ESMA secretariat was responsible for SFDR reached out to me on LinkedIn and said, "Oh, we'd like to, talk to you about your comments." Sure, okay. So I got on a call with them, and I basically ranted for more than an hour on why SFDR is so utterly incompetently drafted. And the reason goes back to my master's thesis. What SFDR encourages is the investment into green so-called companies. Where are most green companies actually easily accessible? Listed equities. What is a completely useless way of allocating money to make the world a better place? Listed equities. All it does is slosh big chunks of money around a liquid market, making absolutely no additionality whatsoever. And you have an entire regulatory regime, thousands of people implementing this, to be honest, absolute piece of crap regulation. So the end result of SFDR, the end result, there may be more people investing in funds that have absolutely no impact in the world. Not only that, SFDR penalizes the strategies that do have impact. What has impact in investment? Shareholder activism. Where do you get the biggest bang for buck if you want to be a shareholder activist? Bad companies, where there's room for improvement. So you invest in the third or fourth quartile ESG companies and then push them up a quartile. That's real impact. They can't be labeled Article 9 or even Article 8 in SFDR because they're not investing in green companies. They're investing in brown companies to make them green. Absolute utter incompetence. And venture capital, whereas the other area of investment that you can actually make impact, it's private markets, it's venture capital, it's early stage, it's frontier markets. And with all these principal adverse indicators, good luck getting a venture capital fund, which is 4 engineering dudes in Boston doing battery technologies, ticking all of those DEI boxes. I mean, it's just not going to happen. And then frontier markets. That's the other place where you have real impact on people's lives. Well, most frontier market companies are not green companies, but they're creating jobs, they're creating welfare, they're pulling people out of poverty. None of that would comply with any of the EU regulations. So they're actually disincentivizing where it's most impactful, and they're incentivizing where it is least impactful. So when all this talk about the omnibus and scaling back and all of these people, I'm just like, get rid of it all. I'm sorry. And that might sound really extreme, but it is such an incompetent piece of regulation that I'm just shocked at how few people haven't called these people out on it. I'll give you one final example on this greenwashing business. Now, greenwashing in investment is different from greenwashing in the corporate space. In the corporate space, you can understand, okay, if you're lying about how green your product is, it might actually make a difference to the world, right? It's real. Again, in listed equity funds, a greenwashing exercise like, Deutsche Bank got pinged and, 50 German police, you think German police got better things to do than wrangle ESG methodologies. But, the German police raided, took computers, because you have some company in there that hasn't got quite the ESG scores that it should have had. Well, who cares? Where's the damage? Now, the worst example of ESG greenwashing is, I think it was Vanguard was pinged for having tobacco in an ESG ETF. Oh my God, how terrible for the world. Like, what is the actual harm for having tobacco in an ESG ETF? Absolutely nothing. Whether Vanguard ETF owns that tobacco stock or not, literally nothing changes in the world. Now, what changes? The only harm is the virtue signaling potential of that poor client who can't say with an honest face that they really don't have tobacco in their portfolio. So we're talking about a massive bureaucracy that's been put in place to protect people's virtue signaling feelings. And I think that's just absolutely ridiculous. While at the same time, and I told the HESPA secretariat this, I said, how much do you actually look into making life easier, making it easier to invest in private market impact funds? Did you explore at all making it possible for retail investors to actually invest in illiquid strategies? Right? You realize, don't you, that you ban through your suitability rules, investor protection rules, you ban all retail investors from actually investing in the most impactful things, don't you? And you do also realize that they can buy restaurants. They all burst, right? They can buy Ferraris. They all depreciate, but you cannot let them, for their own good, buy a fund, even if it's a third-time fund of a very diversified fund of funds, whatever. So these are the kind of issues I think we really need to talk about. So where to from here? I think ESG needs an abundance moment. Some of you have probably heard of this book by Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson called Abundance, which came out earlier this year. And it's a full frontal attack from the left on the governance of centrist type bureaucracies. And they're saying, look, we wanted to build a high-speed rail from LA to San Francisco. We've spent $11 billion doing that in the same time that we've spent $11 billion with not a single mile track built. China has built 27,000 kilometers of high-speed rails. I mean, it is not even close. The Second Avenue subway in New York is the most expensive public transport infrastructure ever built. It's over $1 billion a mile. And yet, Delhi can build an entire line for $1 billion. So this is the real challenge that we face. And I think we need an abundance moment where we say, look, what do you want? We want good things. And the only way we can do this is through innovation. Innovation. And I think the attitude of the EU and the EU bureaucrats is like, oh, well, the US is really good at innovating. We're really good at regulating, as if regulating is somehow even remotely comparable to innovating. It is absolutely crazy. So I would call on Europe for its own good to actually really step up and say, look, we have to get rid of a huge chunk of this bureaucracy. We have to innovate. We have to get money into private markets. You got to get into venture capital. We have to get into frontier markets and pull people out of poverty. Or what will happen? It'll all just be China, right? It will all be outsourced to China. And Europe, again, will end up being a fairy castle tourist attraction, which is the liquid industry. I'm not saying tourism is a great issue, but I think Europe can do a lot more. And with that, I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm sure you'll agree that was certainly worth waiting for. Wonderful, James. Thanks ever so much indeed for being here and for giving us that. That brings us to the end of the GSCS for this year. We do hope there'll be one for next year, and we'll hope to receive some good positive feedback so that we could make that case. But thank you again for being here. We're very pleased, and we'll look forward to next year. Maybe I could just, I think I'll be called to...
No, they can just say.
Oh yeah, and of course, you're very welcome to stay and enjoy the evening here. But anyway, thank you so much again. Thank you.